So you saw this earlier, and if you remember, I kind of started by saying surface to sky to sea, and I guess those are the three touch points that somehow all the speakers have touched on, which is kind of remarkable. I mean, it wasn't planned. We didn't have a conversation beforehand. I mean, it just so happens. But these are kind of prevalent themes. Impacts of climate change, impacts of technology, impacts of globalization, impacts on the shortage of space, so on and so forth. And this has actually had a huge resonance in the work that we do. Can I first of all see a hands up for architects in the room? I mean, I'm not going to point out the people with the black frame glasses or the black roll necks, but generally, hands up for the architects. Come on, are you kidding me? You know architects over here? Are you serious? You're not architects. Some of you look like architects, but okay, architects. Yeah, you're so typical. Yeah, okay, yeah. So, okay, we have this incredible habit of kind of brandishing a black pen and thinking that when we design something, it's going to be fantastic. And we rock up to our clients and we kind of say, well, I think this space is going to be beautiful. I think. It's always the word think, isn't it? And, don't you know who I am? I've designed this before, and so you should trust me. I think that after the financial crisis, we're increasingly needing to kind of be slightly more objective about our approach. I think we need to be able to justify through fact and reason our design assertions. And I think as an academic, I'm a professor of sustainable design at Nottingham University and cultural sustainability at Venice University. We very strongly believe in an evidence-based approach to design, pursuing fact and reason through research to ensure that design solutions are grounded, commercially viable, and respectful to people and place. And I guess as some of you designers are already from interdisciplinary backgrounds, I think it's fair to say that we're only going to get a better, sustainable product, and the product being the built environment, if there is a sustainable process in place. And arguably, that sustainable process is very much based on an interdisciplinarity. As Mike highlighted, we are an interdisciplinary studio, and everything is underpinned by the element of fact and reason being the research element. So it's allowed us to kind of tinker with sustainable design, embracing passive and active approaches to create innovative and responsive buildings, such as the Idea House, the first zero-carbon house in Asia. I designed this back in 2008, and I basically went back to the past. It's interesting how we always assume that technology is the kind of the savior of our carbon woes, but it's not. I think that many of the best lessons learned are actually from the past. If we look at Southeast Asia, the kampong tradition is a wonderful starting point for reinterpretation. This house basically reinterpreted the kampong house. Narrow floor plates raised up on stilts to allow for cross-ventilation, narrow floor plates to allow for ambient light to penetrate, and a very, very careful use of technology in order to try and bring it to its carbon zero position. In fact, we did a carbon model of this, and it generates 20,724 kilowatt hours of energy per year, which is more than the 14,000 kilowatt hours of an average family of 5 in Malaysia would consume. Thus, it is actually generating more energy than it actually was consuming. This basically paved the way for B House, the first carbon negative house in Singapore, which we recently completed. The client of this house basically saw the Idea House in Malaysia and said, I want one of those. Can you do it in Malaysia, but for the same cost as an average house? So the gauntlet was thrown down, and we kind of said stupidly, yes, well, let's give it a go. Sure enough, 2 years later, we managed to create a carbon negative house at the same cost as an average house in Singapore, and it generates more energy than it can consume. All of this has been documented in a book that I wrote in 2011 that looks at a sustainable approach to zero carbon development called The Idea House, Future Tropical Living Today. But what about the sky? I mean, if that's the surface, if our future is looking at more quantifiable measures of designing sustainably, for instance, what Dr. Kerr was talking about regarding carbon footprinting and the importance of understanding carbon over assessment methods, how about trying to bring that ethos into more high-density development? This is Nova by Century. It's a carbon zero development. It's going to be the home to approximately 20,000 people, 50-hectare development in Quezon City. But this can similarly be applied vertically. The Vale in Kuala Lumpur is a vertical extrapolation of the city. It incorporates retail, office, residential, hotel, bars and restaurants, and the Vale-like element is almost a nod to the cultural sensitivity of the place. This Vale, this tudung for those Malaysians out there, is basically providing almost a nod to the culture of the place, but it's also providing shade and shelter to the low-angle sun to the east and the west. The gardens that separate the different functions are then interlinked by a vertical green channel that also helps reduce the ambient temperatures of the building. This has been kind of covered in a book that I wrote, which summarized 10 years of my research into the role of sky courts and sky gardens, and it basically profiles 40 buildings around the world, buildings that have been completed, buildings under construction, buildings on the drawing board, and the future vision of students and academics as to how we should green our urban habitat in the future. And maybe we need to be kind of having a chat afterwards to see how we can be bringing some of your projects and some of your students' works into addition to. And what about the sea? So we've seen the surface, we've seen the sky. What about the sea? As I mentioned before, 35 of the mega cities are actually in floodplains in the world. We're increasingly seeing the impact of climate change in rising sea levels. We had the privilege of working with this kind of barrister at law who decided to give up his day job and actually want to do a development that also sort of made a nod to the national flower of Malaysia, the hibiscus. This waterborne development is basically an opportunity to think about how we can adapt a surface that is accountable for 2/3 of the earth, water. Our vision for the future is that we shouldn't necessarily be thinking about purely centralized development in city centers. If half the world's population are living in inner city centers right now, if 75% will be living in inner city centres by 2050, we also need to be thinking about alternative spaces for urban development. It doesn't necessarily mean that we need to go tall. If 2/3 of the surface area of the Earth is water, perhaps this is an opportunity to create more flood-resilient communities. That's something that I've been working with the University of Venice on, and this is our approach to sustainable development in Venice. And it's the subject of the book here, POG Off-Grid. It'll be in the bookshops by the end of May, and I look forward to sort of sharing some of the ideas here with you afterwards. So go and get the book, basically. And final point I would say is about Venice and culture. Right at the beginning I was showing you a giant McDonald's sign right next to some sort of antiquated Chinese architecture, and increasingly we're seeing the waves of globalization affecting what is actually our own cultural heritage. I think that in the future we need to be as focused on cultural preservation and cultural sustainability as we are about social sustainability. So if any of you are interested in a workshop in Venice between the 19th of September to the 23rd of September, Sustain and Retain, with one of the eminent leaders on conservation and heritage, Luigi Croce, and myself, you are more than welcome to attend. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much. You've been a remarkable, calm audience, and please dig into the remaining snacks and drink as much alcohol as possible so that we can continue the conversation afterwards. Many thanks.